She said it on a Friday morning in September, standing on the dock with her hands full of fishing line and her hair half undone by the wind off the lake. He hadn't meant to say what he said. It came out the way honest things sometimes do, before the careful part of him could catch it. Whoever ends up with you, Iris, is going to have everything figured out for them. He meant it plainly, a compliment. The kind a neighbor says to a neighbor when the sun is good and there's nothing particularly wrong with the world. She didn't laugh it off. She went still the way the lake goes still just before a storm decides what it wants to do. Her hands stayed on the line. Then she looked at him, not the quick social look people give each other across docks and fences, but the real one, the kind that costs something. And she said very quietly, "I was starting to think you'd never figure out it was supposed to be you." The lake kept moving. The line went slack in her hands. A loon called from somewhere past the point, unhurried and indifferent, and Caleb Morrow stood on that dock in northern Ontario and understood that something had just shifted between them that couldn't be shifted back. He wasn't entirely sure he wanted it shifted back. Caleb Morrow was 31 years old and ran a modest logging operation outside the town of Dunvara, Ontario, on the edge of a lake the locals called Greywater for the way it looked in November. He had inherited the operation from his uncle at 24, which meant he had also inherited the debt, the equipment, the 3 men who worked it with him, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being responsible for things before you've learned what you actually want. He wasn't unhappy. That was the thing about Caleb. People who were obviously unhappy got attention, got questions, got casseroles brought to their door. Caleb was fine in a way that made people forget to check on him. He worked hard, he paid his debts. He went to bed tired most nights with the reasonable satisfaction of a man who had done what needed doing. What he didn't have, what he had quietly stopped looking for around year 3, was someone to come home to. The Vachon family lived 3 properties east, separated from Caleb's land by a stand of white birch and a road that turned to mud every spring without fail. Henri Vachon ran a small fly fishing guide service out of Greywater Lodge, which he operated with his wife, Paulette, and their younger daughter, Iris. Iris Vachon was 28 years old. She had come back to Dunvara 4 years ago after 2 years in Thunder Bay doing something with community health that nobody in town entirely understood but everyone agreed sounded important. She had come back without explanation and without drama, and within a week of returning she had quietly resumed the work of keeping her family's operation running in the ways that didn't have a job title. Managing the bookings, fixing the dock planks, driving her father to his knee appointments in Sudbury, making sure the guests felt looked after without being hovered over. She did all of this the way some people breathe, without announcement, without requiring anyone to notice. Caleb had known her for years in the loose, neighborly way of people who share a road and a post office and a hardware store. He had spoken to her at community meetings. He had eaten Paulette Vachon's cooking at 3 different fundraising dinners. He had once helped Henri pull a boat motor out of the shallows after a bad storm, and Iris had handed him tools from the dock without being asked, knowing which one he needed before he asked for it. He had thought vaguely that Henri Vachon had raised a capable daughter. He had not understood until that particular September what he was actually looking at. The dock at Greywater Lodge ran about 40 feet out over the water, and in late summer, when the guests had mostly gone and the season was winding down, Iris used it for things that had nothing to do with guests, repairing lines, sorting gear, watching the water the way people watch fires when they need to think. Caleb had been walking the shoreline checking the boundary stakes when he saw her. He wasn't going to stop. He had things to do. He stopped anyway, but Iris. She looked up Caleb. A brief, easy nod. Boundary markers again? Spring floods moved 2 of them. They always move that one by the birch stand. She went back to the line. Papa keeps meaning to set them in concrete. They talked for a few minutes about nothing urgent, the early frost the week before, whether the Hendersons up the road were going to sell, what that might mean for the east side of the lake. Then she went back to her work and he walked on, and the water moved under the dock, and the birches made their dry September sound, and Caleb Morrow got 20 feet down the shore and stopped for no reason he could name. He stayed stopped for a moment. Then he went back to the boundary markers, but he thought about the conversation for the rest of the day, which was unusual, because it had been about nothing. The Dunvara Harvest Supper happened every year in the community hall the second Saturday of October. It was the kind of event that mattered enormously in small northern towns, a reason to see everyone you'd been meaning to see all summer, to eat things that took 3 hours to make, to hear about the year people had had and offer your own in return. Caleb arrived to find the Vachon family already there. Henri in his good flannel shirt, Paulette with her hair done up properly, and Iris in a dark green sweater that was simple and warm, and somehow entirely right for who she was. She was helping set out the dessert table with 2 of the older women from town, and she was laughing at something one of them said, her whole face open with it. Caleb found himself across the room holding a coffee he didn't remember getting. He danced once with Marlene Ouellette, who ran the post office and had been a good friend of his uncle's, and who told him in a voice of complete practical kindness that he'd been watching Iris Vachon since he walked in. "I haven't been staring," he said. "Caleb," said Marlene, "I've known you since you were learning to drive on this road. You've been staring." He changed the subject. He was good at that. But later, driving home on the gravel road with the trees a dark wall on either side and the stars hard and bright over the lake, he thought about it honestly. The way you can, alone in a truck at night, when there's no one to perform for. Iris Vachon, his neighbor, capable and dry and warm in a way she didn't broadcast. Someone who knew which tool he needed before he asked. Someone who laughed with her whole face. He stopped the truck in the driveway and sat there for a minute. She was someone he wanted to see every day. He hadn't known that until this exact moment. But now that he knew it, it had the feeling of something that had been true for a long time before he had the sense to look at it directly. He sat in the dark truck for a while, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Then he went inside and made himself a cup of tea and went to bed, and thought about it some more until he fell asleep, which took longer than usual. Old Gord Tessier lived at the end of the lake road in a house he had built himself 60 years ago, and had been refusing to leave ever since, despite his daughter in Sudbury calling every winter to suggest he might consider it. He was 79, had bad knees, worse hearing, and opinions about everything that he shared freely and without request. Iris brought him food twice a week. Caleb found this out when he saw her truck going past one Tuesday morning, a covered pot on the seat beside her. He had no particular reason to follow. He went back inside. Then he got his jacket and drove after her. He caught up at Gord's driveway and pulled in behind her. She turned and looked at him. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm here anyway." She considered him for a moment with that expression she had, assessing, not unkind, and then picked up the pot and walked to the door. What Caleb discovered that morning at Gord Tessier's kitchen table was something he should have known already. Iris Vachon was extraordinary company, not in a loud way, not in a way that demanded you notice it. She had opinions, considered ones, offered when they were relevant, never forced, and she noticed things. The way Gord's woodpile was getting low and what that meant going into October, the way his dog was favoring one back leg and had been for a few weeks, what it might cost to fix and whether the vet in town or the one in Capriol was worth the drive. She was funny in a way that came at you sideways. She said something about the dog's expression during their discussion of his leg that made Gord laugh for a full 30 seconds, which Caleb suspected was more laughing than the old man had done in a month. Gord waited until Iris was in the kitchen, recovering the pot, then looked at Caleb and said, at a volume that made no concessions to privacy, "You know you're a damn fool, right?" Caleb kept his voice low. "I'm working on it." Gord made a sound that was probably approval, or possibly digestion. With Gord, it was sometimes hard to tell. On the drive back, they didn't talk about what Gord had said. They talked about the woodpile, whether Caleb's crew could spare an afternoon in November, what kind of wood Gord preferred. The conversation was easy in the particular way of two people who don't feel compelled to fill every moment with something. When they reached the fork where the road split toward their respective properties, Iris slowed and looked at him through the window. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It's easier with company." He drove home thinking about that phrase, easier with company. Not flattering, not romantic, just true. He liked that about her. The way she said true things. It was a Friday in late September. Caleb had gone down to the shared section of shoreline to check the boundary stakes that had shifted again. They always shifted after the summer boats, when he heard Iris on her family's dock. She was untangling a mess of fly line that someone had returned in a state that suggested they had tried to use it to catch something much larger than the lake contained. She was also, he noticed, talking quietly to herself or possibly to the line, in a tone that suggested the line was losing the argument. He stood there a moment longer than he should have. The September light on the water, the birches yellowing at the edge of the property. The sound of her voice, low and matter-of-fact, carrying across the water. She looked up and saw him and raised a hand. He walked to the dock. They talked about the boundary markers. They talked about whether the ice would come early this year. They talked about Gord's woodpile and whether the plan was coming together. A comfortable pause, the kind that happens between people who have stopped needing to perform ease because the ease is simply there. He was watching her work at the line, her hands patient and precise, her attention complete. He was thinking about what Gord had said, what Marlene had said, what he himself had concluded, alone in a truck in the dark, that he hadn't been able to unconvince himself of since. And then, before the careful part of him had a chance to frame it more diplomatically, it came out. Whoever ends up with you, Iris, is going to have everything figured out for them. He meant it as an honest observation. A neighbor thing to say. He expected her to roll her eyes or make some dry comment about the line she was untangling or change the subject with the efficient grace she applied to conversations that were getting inconvenient. Instead, she went still. Her hands stayed on the line. The color came up in her face, slowly, not dramatic, just a quiet deepening. She didn't look at him right away, then she did. And the expression on her face was one he had never seen there before. It was open and careful and decided all at once. I was starting to think you'd never figure out it was supposed to be you, she said. The lake kept moving. A loon called from somewhere past the point. The birches let go of a few leaves into the water without consulting anyone about it. Caleb stood on the shore and understood that something had changed between them that could not be changed back. He stood with that for a moment. Then he said, because he was a man who said what he meant even when it took him a while to mean it. I meant what I said. She was still looking at him steadily. I know you did. That's part of why I said what I said. A beat. How long? He asked. She looked back at the line, began working it again. Longer than I was planning to tell you today. That's fair. You're slow, she said. Not unkind, just accurate. I'm slow, he agreed. She set the untangled section of line in her lap and looked at the water. I came back to Dunvera, you know. People ask why, and I say it was for Papa, for the lodge, for the reasons that make sense to say out loud. A pause. Those were true. They weren't the whole truth. He didn't say anything. He had learned in the past weeks that she finished what she was saying if you let her. I drove past your road the day I got back, she said. You were on the roof of the equipment shed fixing something. You waved without knowing who it was. She didn't look at him. And I thought, there he is. And then I thought, well, that's a problem. He stood with that for a moment. 4 years. She had carried that for 4 years, quietly, without performance, without requiring anything of him, while he'd been vaguely registering her existence and going to bed tired. Iris, he said, would it be all right if I came over to talk to your father? She finally looked at him. A small, slow smile, the kind that had nowhere to hide. He already likes you, she said. He's been wondering what was taking so long. She picked up her basket and walked toward the lodge. Caleb stood on the shore until she reached the door, and then a little longer after that, feeling like a man who had nearly walked past something so important it didn't bear thinking about. He went the next evening. Clean shirt, combed hair, more nervous than he'd been in years, and he'd bid on a government timber contract at 30 years old, which had seemed high stakes at the time. Henri Vachon was on the porch, which told Caleb that Iris had said something. Henri was a compact, quiet man with gray at his temples and the particular patience of someone who had spent 30 years reading water for fish. He gestured at the empty chair beside him. They sat for a moment looking at the lake going orange in the last of the evening light. I'd like to come calling on Iris, Caleb said. Properly, if you're willing. Henri was quiet. Then, what took you? Caleb looked at him. I mean it sincerely, Henri said. Paulette and I have been watching you work this out. For 3 years, we were starting to think we might have to say something at the post office in front of witnesses. I'm slow, Caleb said. It was the most accurate thing he knew about himself at the moment. "You're careful," Henri said, which is a better version of the same thing. He looked at the water. "Iris doesn't ask for things, never has, but she deserves a man who actually sees her, not the version of her that's useful to have around. I see her," Caleb said. Henri was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way men of few words nod when the few words have landed right. "Paulette makes coffee at 8 most mornings, if you want to start there. And at supper. And at Sunday afternoon walks around the lake road, and at Gord Tessier's place with the woodpile, and at the hardware store in town where he found her 3 times in 3 weeks by coincidence that eventually stopped being coincidence. He learned things. That she read history and could talk about it without making you feel like you should have read more of it yourself. That she had a strong opinion about the right way to pack a canoe that she had developed through extensive experience with people doing it wrong. That she was patient with almost everything except inefficiency, and that she made an exception for inefficiency when the inefficient person was genuinely trying. That she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, and that when he caught her at it, she didn't look away. He brought her coffee one morning when he was passing the dock anyway. Just left it on the post where she'd see it. No note, she texted him 3 hours later. "Decent beans, terrible timing. I was almost done with the morning lines, then, thank you." He understood from the second message that the first one didn't mean what it seemed to mean. One evening in late October, walking back from Gord's along the lake road with the last of the leaves coming down around them, she said something he had been turning over for weeks afterward, that she thought people confused patience with passivity, that waiting for something wasn't the same as doing nothing, that she had been, in her own way, working towards something for a long time, even when there was nothing visible to show for it. "What were you working toward?" he asked. She looked at the road ahead. "A life that made sense," she said. "Here. With the right person in it." A pause. "Are you getting there?" he asked. She glanced at him. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again in the spring." He asked her on a Thursday evening in November, at the end of the dock, which was where they had started. He had thought about other places, the ridge above the lake with the sunset, the community hall in front of people who'd known them both for years, something elaborate enough to match what he felt, which was considerable. But when the moment came, the dock was where they were standing because they'd just come back from checking on Gord and the sky was doing something extraordinary over the water, and neither of them had been trying to make a moment. The moment had simply arrived. He had his grandmother's ring in his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting to be sure. He had eventually decided that being sure was a thing you did, not a thing you waited to feel. "Iris," he said. She turned. He said it the way she'd taught him to say things, without dressing it up too much. "I know I was slow. I know it took me longer than it should have to understand what was right in front of me. But I understand it now, and I'm not interested in being slow about this part." He paused. "I want to be here for the things that matter to you. The lodge, your father's appointments, Gord's woodpile, the lines you untangle every fall. I want to be the person you call when something goes wrong and the person you tell first when something goes right." He looked at her. "I want to be on this lake with you for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes bright in the last of the light. "Caleb Morrow," she said. "I drove past your road 5 years ago, and I thought, there he is, and it took you until a dock in September to catch up." She was smiling. "The real kind. Yes. Obviously, yes." He put his grandmother's ring on her finger there on the dock with the lake going dark around them and the loons out somewhere past the point doing what loons do in November, which is mostly complain about the cold. She looked at the ring. Not at the ring, exactly. At what it meant. At the life it stood for. Then she looked up at him and he kissed her for the first time, and the dock moved slightly under them the way docks do, and the birches stood at the edge of the property, bare now, patient as they'd always been. That winter was the best one Caleb could remember in years, which was saying something, because winters on Greywater Lake were not gentle. There was equipment to service and timber contracts to manage, and 2 stretches in January where the cold came down off the shield and made everything difficult and slow. But there was also coffee at the Vacon kitchen table most mornings. There were evenings beside the Vacan's wood stove with Henri talking about the water and Paulette feeding people who didn't need to be told twice. There was the knowledge, solid and reliable as the ice on the lake, that something had been decided. Caleb worked on his house that winter. He didn't mention it to Iris. He replaced the floor in the main room, which had been uneven for 2 years, and that he'd been putting off in the vague way of a person who has no particular reason to hurry. He repaired the back step properly. He put a new window in the kitchen, facing east, because the morning light on the lake came from that direction, and he thought she would want to see it. He didn't tell her any of this. He just did it because the house was going to be hers too, even if she didn't live there yet. Paulette Vachon, when she heard the news properly, had cried in the way of a woman who had been holding something in for a considerable time. She held Iris's hand and looked at the ring and then at Caleb and said, "I told Henri on the night of the harvest supper." I said, "That boy is going to figure it out eventually." Henry had nodded from across the room in a way that suggested he had arrived at this conclusion rather earlier. Marlene Ouellette at the post office said, "Oh, finally," with an emphasis that made Caleb suspect the whole of Dunvera had been considerably more aware of the situation than he had been. Gord Tessier, when told, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Well, don't waste any more time being slow about things." He paused. "I want to be at the wedding." Another pause. "I want cake." There was cake. In March, Iris came to look at the house with her mother. Caleb stayed out of it. He went and checked the boundary stakes, which didn't need checking, and spent an hour being busy elsewhere while the two of them walked through the rooms. He came back to find Iris standing in the kitchen, looking at the east window and the way the late winter light was coming through it. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You put this in," she said. "I did. When?" "January." She was quiet. "Why east?" "Morning light comes from that direction," he said. "Thought you'd want to see the lake when you woke up." She stood there for another moment. Then she walked across the kitchen and took his hand and held it the way you hold something you have decided you're going to keep. "Thank you," she said. Just that. He understood she was not thanking him for the window. They were married in June, a Saturday, when the birches were fully leaved and the lake was the deep summer blue it became for about 10 weeks a year and was worth the other 42 weeks to see. Most of Dunvera came. Henri Vachon's voice caught when he walked his daughter down the aisle outside the community hall, which caused a sympathetic response through several rows and at least 3 people who would not have predicted it of themselves. Iris wore a dress her mother had made. Cream linen, simple, no fuss. She walked toward Caleb with her face clear and certain, and Caleb thought, with the full force of a man who understands what things cost, "I cannot believe I took so long." They said their vows looking at each other, not at the room. The room was welcome to watch. The vows were for each other, then they were married. Gord Tessier got his cake. Old Carson from 3 townships over had offered his fiddle and was better than anyone had expected. The dancing went until the lake's silver in the long June twilight. That night, in the house with the east window, Iris sat at the kitchen table of tea and the light from outside soft on the walls, and she looked at Caleb across the table and said, "We're going to be very good here, you know." "I know," he said. "You're still slow," she said. "But you get there." "I get there," he agreed. She smiled, the real one, the kind with nowhere to hide. The years that followed were built from ordinary days and the particular richness of 2 people who choose each other and keep choosing each other in the small ways that don't get remarked on but are the whole structure of a life. The lodge grew. Iris expanded the booking season and added 2 new guides, both local, both taught by Henri, who was pleased enough about this to say so directly, which was not his usual way. Caleb's operation grew steadily, and he brought on a 4th crew member, a young man from town who reminded him of himself at 23, and who he therefore worked harder than the others, which the young man seemed to appreciate. Iris ran the household accounts because she was better with numbers. This was simply true, and both of them knew it, and no one felt any particular way about it. She also, without announcing it, organized an informal tool-lending arrangement among the properties around Greywater Lake so that people in a pinch didn't have to drive to Sudbury for equipment they needed for 3 days. It was a practical idea that she had without fully realizing it was also the kind of thing people would still be talking about 15 years later. Their daughter came in the spring of the third year. They named her Paulette for Iris's mother, who received this information with the kind of crying that has nothing to do with sadness. She arrived with strong opinions and an ability to make herself heard across considerable distances, which Caleb said came from Iris and Iris said came from Caleb and was probably both. Their son came 2 years after that, Thomas for nobody in particular, because it was the name that fit him. He had Iris's patience and Caleb's tendency towards silence, a combination that would serve him very well. On a Friday evening in the autumn of their 5th year, Caleb was on the dock checking the winter tie-downs when Iris came down with both children, Paulette running ahead, Thomas toddling humbled behind with the particular intensity of a 2-year-old who has decided to keep up and will not be swayed. She raised a hand when she saw him. He jumped down and went to them. Paulette immediately demanded to be carried on his shoulders. Thomas, with the moral seriousness of someone who has very recently figured out walking and considers it a major achievement, demanded the same. A negotiation followed that ultimately pleased nobody and therefore satisfied everyone. Later, when the children had tired themselves out and were leaning against their parents in the last of the afternoon light, Iris rested her head against Caleb's shoulder and was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You know what I've been thinking about? What that first summer, the dock, what you said." A pause. "Whoever ends up with you is going to have everything figured out for them." "You were right," she said. "She does." He looked at her. "I'm the lucky one." "We're both lucky," she said, in the practical tone she used when something was obviously true and didn't need arguing about. "We're both lucky," he agreed. The birches at the edge of the property had gone their October gold. The lake held the last of the afternoon light on its surface, flat and bright and faithful. Don Vera kept being Don Vera, small and cold in particular, and full of people trying to build lives worth building on the edge of a lake that didn't care either way, which somehow made the building feel more worthwhile. And Caleb Morrow held his family on the dock in the fading light and understood, with the complete weight of a man who knows exactly what things cost, what he had almost let himself miss. He'd been slow. He knew it. He knew it in the specific grateful way of someone who made it anyway, and understood that making it was not a small thing. Iris was not a complicated woman to understand. She was simply easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention, which is the most dangerous kind of person to have right next door. She had known what she wanted for years and said nothing, not out of weakness, but because she understood that the right moment is the one that's actually ready, and she was patient enough to wait for it. The bravest thing she did was answer him honestly when she could have simply untangled her line and let the moment pass. She chose not to. And everything that followed, the house with the east window, the lake in June, the children on the dock in October, all of it, came from that one choice, made on a September morning by a woman who decided that honesty was worth the risk. It usually is. The hard part is remembering that when the moment arrives, don't wait for someone else to name it first.